Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
2023 was a record year for space activities, including the largest number of rocket launches, the largest mass to orbit ever achieved, and a wide variety of space missions by a growing number of countries and companies. In short, it's getting pretty busy up there. How can we keep ourselves safe and free from collision and conflict? Robin Dickey is a space policy and strategy analyst at the Aerospace Corporation's Center for Space Policy and Strategy. She focuses on national security, space, geopolitics, and international relations. She recently published a paper titled Spaceships Passing in the Night, Translating Maritime Rules of the Road for the Space Domain, which sheds light on this situation. And Robin, thanks for joining us and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So what inspired you to write this paper?
So I've spent the last 3 or 4 years focusing on the development of norms of behavior for space. And through those years, I've kind of been transitioning from how do we do norms to what should those norms be. So this paper is really one of those first pitches when it comes to what should some norms of behavior for space look like, and in this case, drawing from the maritime domain.
So then what are the key takeaways from the paper, and how do you relate to the space commerce industry?
So when I decided to pick this specific treaty that I use in the paper, which is the 1972 collision regulations, I wanted to translate that in particular to space for this paper because it is really useful in establishing a couple core principles that are good for avoiding collisions kind of no matter where you are. Even if you're in 3 dimensions in space, the physics can get really complicated and crazy, and some things about communication can be extra difficult. But some of these maritime domain principles help make it easier to make the interactions between different satellites and different satellite operators more regular, more predictable, less risky. And all of those things can help ensure in the long term that commerce in space is able to flourish. Because if there's a lot of risk, a lot of concern, or if collisions have happened and there's a lot of debris cluttering the orbital environment, that just makes it so much harder to operate a business or any other kind of activity in space. And so the main principles that I translated, the main takeaways, was the idea of how to identify what could be a potentially risky collision. There have been proposals out there or discussions about a minimum safe distance, but that doesn't really work in space because of the physics of how different orbits interact with each other. So instead, and this is something that the maritime domain does too, is looking at the probability of collision and what are different factors that could make that probability worse. So are there hazards in the area? How good is your situational awareness, which in space means how good are your sensors for space situational awareness? And other factors like, are you maneuverable? Can you get out of the way, or do you need perhaps more lead time in order to make a change? And then the other two big themes that I look at, which we can go into more detail later, are how do you decide who should move if there's 2 satellites that might be about to collide with each other? And then also, how do you communicate between those different satellites? And not all the specifics of the maritime domain really work for that. You know, you can't use your foghorn, you can't flash your lights or any of that, because the operators of the satellites aren't on the satellites, they're on the ground, sometimes thousands of miles away from each other. So that means we instead translate the principles of how do you do direct communication, so email, pick up the phone, etc., or how do you do methods of broad communication, like should satellites have GPS transponders that are pinging and telling you where that satellite is so that you can deconflict a little more easily. So a lot of stuff going on, a lot of moving parts, quite literally, but that's a bit of a summary of what's in the paper.
At sea, and I was a sailor for a long time, but it was always that tonnage determined right of way. Is that going to be something that we're going to find in the space domain as well? Is that the bigger you are, the easier it is for the smaller vessel, for lack of a better term, to get out of the way?
Uh, Not entirely. There is a role that mass plays in your ability to maneuver, or how much propellant you have to use in order to change your direction. But really, if you focus on that core question that tonnage at sea implies, which is how maneuverable are you? That's the ultimate question that we have to think about with satellites. And the idea is that debris, which does not maneuver, always has right of way. If you don't move, it's hitting you because it's not going to move out of the way. But similar to how sailing vessels typically have right of way over other kinds of powered vessels because sailing has a lot of limits on exactly how you can maneuver, satellites that have a very limited amount of maneuverability might need to have right of way, in a sense, over those who are designed to maneuver much more. Also, you have to consider in space automated maneuver versus maneuver by an operator who's actually making the decisions. And that the satellites that maneuver automatically should potentially have a rule where you expect those to get out of the way instead of expecting the one where someone actually has to hop on and make a decision. So a couple different factors.
Why did you determine that you wanted to use maritime law, the COLA reg, as opposed to the federal aviation regulations, the FARs, which might seem that aviation would be a closer comparison to space than maritime is?
So the first piece of this is that the specific treaty, the COLREG's convention that I translated, was not meant to be the only analogy that people should look to for space. So there are plenty of other treaties, documents, other domains where you could pull from to get the treaties. The reason why maritime is particularly good, and particularly good as a place to start, is the idea of those international waters. So it's more of a legal question than a physics question, because airspace is so divided up in terms of national responsibilities. And that's not the case at all in space. No country can claim sovereignty in outer space. And so it's all a means of collaboration and operator to operator interactions instead of whose orbit is this, whose space is this. That doesn't exist. And so that's why international waters and these kinds of ad hoc captain to captain interactions at sea are a better analog, specifically when it comes to preventing collisions.
Do you think that, and this is a question that just occurs to me, but we're looking more and more at, when you talk about aviation, autonomous drone operation, and that's going to be kind of a similar situation, I would think, to satellites that are in an orbit where they don't have an operator on board, and yet they do have some kind of an automated way of avoiding collisions. Is that something that you think will be integrated as we go forward in avoiding collisions in space?
Well, it's with space, that's something that you had to think of from the beginning. So it would be interesting to really see if lessons learned from space flow in the other direction as other domains get more automated activity, because this is one of the few areas in which space has more experience than any other domain, because except for a very small number of the International Space Station, for example, we've all had to do it remote the whole time.
Address, if you would, the NOAA's Office of Space Commerce TRACKIS program. How do you see that interacting and being a way to help avoid collisions in space?
So I would not claim to be an expert on the TRACKIS program. The history of the development of the U.S. government in general, originally it was actually the Department of Defense providing as a public service notifications on potential collisions between satellites. That's something that's being discussed. There's been legislation, the policy direction about moving those capabilities into the Office of Space Commerce at NOAA. This is still like a developing field, so I wouldn't be able to comment on where it's going to go because I don't know. But certainly the notion of information sharing on space situational awareness is a huge piece of both international and national norms discussions. Because if you don't know where you are and where others are relative to you and where they're going, then you are really, you've shot yourself in the foot from day one, because it is so hard to maneuver, it's so costly to maneuver, that the more precise information you have, that helps you make sure that you're maneuvering when you need to maneuver and that you're not maneuvering when you don't need to maneuver. And so from both a policy and a technical front, that will be a really interesting space to watch.
And when it gets back to the space commerce aspect of things, because there are several companies right now that are developing space situational awareness systems, for lack of a better term, is it conceivable that those things would be proprietary enough that you might not be able to get the information you need to be able to avoid a collision because you're not signed up to some company's service that gives you that data?
It's an interesting question for sure, because there is this mix of commercial offerings and government services and offerings. It's hard to see necessarily where that balance will be in the future. But a lot of the discussion that comes out is, what is the difference between a baseline public service that ensures safety questions like don't crash into each other versus what might be more advanced commercial offerings that provide greater detail? Yeah, where that line is drawn is certainly an interesting question. But with space situational awareness, just like with almost every other mission area that you can see in space, we're just seeing a blossoming of commercial activity alongside a lot of the other kinds of government and international activity that had been directed already. So it will be interesting to see how they relate to each other in the future.
Is there, Robin, enough geopolitical will by the spacefaring nations to begin this process? I mean, can we at least get it underway, or is it just going to take some time to bring it to a fruition?
This is something that I have to grapple with a lot when it comes to discussing norm development. It can seem really hard to develop the amount of political will needed to get especially more binding, more thoroughly written out agreements in place. And historically, it often has been the case that it's taken some kind of accident or catastrophe to get things out the door, to get the ball rolling. But with space, we really see a lot of efforts that are underway now to try to get the norms before the catastrophe happens. Because the problem is with space in particular is if you have a major collision that produces tons of debris, especially in these increasingly crowded commercial orbits, then it might be too late to fix things with norms and policies. So I do think there's broad recognition that if we can get these policies, these norms underway now, then we can maybe avert the catastrophe. And that if we wait for that to happen in order to have a justification, we're in big trouble.
When I was a much younger person, there was a video game called Asteroids. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I am, yeah.
And part of the thing about that game was that you would shoot an asteroid and then the pieces would break off and they would go in random directions. Is that what happens in a space collision? Is that pieces of whatever gets hit, just you can't predict the trajectories of where all that debris is going to go?
Well, I think my physicist friends would disagree with the notion of the random directions. You know, the physics gives reasons and rules to all of this motion in space, but it can be hard to predict and hard to track, especially if there are small pieces of debris. So yeah, traditionally, kind of 10 centimeters had been the benchmark of debris that would be relatively easy to track and follow. But there are hundreds of thousands, millions even, of pieces of debris that are way smaller than that. And those can still be incredibly damaging and even deadly to satellites. You know, a paint fleck, when it's traveling at 17,000 miles per hour, is, you know, a tiny ballistic missile. And that can be just horribly damaging to satellites. And those are difficult to track and predict. Whereas these days, the larger pieces are still very scary and very damaging, but they're easier to follow, especially in low Earth orbit, because that's closer to the Earth, that's closer to these sensors. We're watching all of that pretty seriously.
I'm talking with Robin Dickey from the Aerospace Corporation on the Terra podcast. Take a moment right now to click subscribe to be sure you don't miss any of the podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Terra, the Journal of Space Commerce. Robin, tell me a little bit about your background and how you got into this.
So as a current space policy analyst, I have an interesting kind of weaving path that I took to get here. I've always been mainly a policy person, a international relations focused in my studies, but I actually grew up with two parents who were aerospace engineers, so I grew up kind of space adjacent, I'd like to say. And although space wasn't my focus when I started my career in my education, I had a bit of an epiphany at one point. I think it was 2018 or so, when I noticed that a lot of the people in the international relations, policy, national security sphere were a little uncertain about how to talk about space because it's so technical, all these crazy physics involved. It is rocket science. It's literal rocket science. But I realized that there is a lot of bridging that needs to happen between the policy world and the space world, because all of these problems are ultimately still people problems. People design the satellites, they sell the services. All of this comes down to policies, economics, international relations that are in some ways recognizable to what we do on Earth. So that was kind of the inspiration that led me almost directly into the Aerospace Corporation, where I am today.
And can you tell me more about the Aerospace Corporation and its mission?
Absolutely. So the Aerospace Corporation is a federally funded research and development center, or FFRDC, and we focus on all of the space enterprise. So we provide technical expertise, support, guidance for all of these different pieces of the U.S. space enterprise that need to interact with space in some way. So you name it, if it's a space system, we probably have a PhD somewhere in the company who is able to work on that subject and has deep expertise. And then nestled within aerospace is the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, which is the team that I work on. And we're basically a policy-focused think tank that has access to the full technical backplane. So when I wrote my paper on the translating maritime to space policies, I spent a lot of time running it by the physicists and the satellite operator experts at the Aerospace Corporation to make sure that what I was saying actually made sense. So that's a bit of a nutshell of how both of those work within each other.
So then what kinds of products and services does the Aerospace Corporation offer to its customers, and who are those customers?
So, like I said, especially if you're in the U.S. government and you do space, there's a good chance that you've worked with the Aerospace Corporation in some capacity, but we'll provide mission assurance, so meaning analysis to make sure that your satellites, your rockets are safe and they're going to function. But we work with the Department of Defense, NASA, NOAA, and the Office of Space Commerce, all of these different agencies across the government. And that means you also have to be able to interact with and have knowledge with different commercial companies internationally. The space enterprise is so broad and interconnected that it's hard to not have involvement in discussion and interaction across the board.
What are, Robin, some of the most significant trends and challenges facing the space industry today?
Oh, that's a great question. There's so many.
Take your time. I've got all day.
Of course, a bit of a bias with my subject matter that I focus on, but developing norms in general. And you can kind of split those into two categories of the safety and sustainability focused questions. So that's this paper. It's focused on how do we not accidentally crash into each other? How do we clean up our space junk? How do we make sure that the space domain is safe and able for anyone to have freedom of operation in the domain? That's one side, and that's very important. The other side, which we haven't talked much about today, is that notion of security in space. And norms are important there too. How do we work with our partners and allies and other countries around the world to ensure that when you're doing something in space, it doesn't cause someone else to freak out, to escalate, to miscalculate, and lead to some kind of conflict or interaction in space, which cycles all the way back around because conflict in space could really wreck the domain for everyone and ruin that freedom of action. So the idea of normalizing how we behave in space, how we understand what each actor in space is doing and why, that's a huge piece that will tackle a lot of different other challenges. And so there's a lot of other issues that could be talked about when it comes to the financing, technology, anything from low Earth orbit to the moon and beyond. All of those activities are really interesting. I tend to focus on that lens of norms of behavior.
But then we go back to talking about geopolitical will, because when you want to have norms of what goes on in space, it's not just the United States. It's not just a single country. We've got to try to find a way to get all these people in a room and say, we need to talk about how everybody's going to interact in space.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of organizations and venues in the United Nations and elsewhere that are focused on these exact issues and have really wide participation. Because I think a lot of people recognize that, one person's bad decision in space could kind of wreck things for everyone, which means that everyone has to, it's all hands on deck, to get back to a naval metaphor, for interacting on these issues. So there's the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPUS, in the UN, and that has over 100 different countries that participate, and they operate by consensus, and they have achieved consensus. There's a set of 21 long-term sustainability guidelines that COPUS agreed to. That is, it's not that specific, and it's not legally binding, but it is a set of behaviors that all these countries have agreed they would like to follow, support, and implement to ensure that sustainability of the space domain. So it's really hard. I would argue that most policy is harder than rocket science, because rockets don't, talk back to question the reasons for their existence. And, the laws of physics don't require consensus in order to exist. But even so, there has been a lot of progress and a lot of interest in recent years.
Going back to the question about trends and challenges, let's talk about the effects of some of those now. What are some of the most exciting developments in the space industry that you're currently following?
It's hard to name one specific development. Instead, I think it's the swell of different companies who are pursuing new crazy technologies, pushing the boundaries further and further, and sometimes even going beyond what has been developed previously by government. It used to be, I do a lot of history when I do my research, that the US and the Soviet Union leading in the Cold War, between their space programs, their launches, their activities. And now that a lot of that is inverted, where we see commercial leading the way in new technologies, in driving down costs. I do think that change in costs is really significant when it comes to accessibility in space, and then in turn enables a lot of further activity and research and development. So I'm just excited about all of it, really.
The whole thing about bringing down costs, and I was having this conversation with someone the other day, was about, they asked me, why are there so many launches now? And I said, well, it doesn't cost as much. And satellites are smaller, and they can do a whole lot more with a whole lot less. And so that is truly becoming a real factor in what's becoming a very crowded space in low Earth orbit.
Absolutely. The easier it is to launch, the more launches we'll see, and the more important it is that we have some way to make sure that we don't crash into each other.
As they say in the airline business, the air traffic controllers engage in a game called Keep the Blips from Bumping. And that's kind of what you're talking about here.
Exactly, yes. The bumping is pretty catastrophic when it comes to space. So we certainly want to keep those two as close to zero as humanly possible.
Absolutely. Robin, what advice would you give to someone who's interested in pursuing a career in the space commerce industry?
Oh, that's a great question. One thing that I always like to talk about, which maybe my use of analogies might indicate, is when you're going into the space field, knowing not only what you're excited about within space itself, but what are you excited about that's tangential to space or interacts with space? Developing areas of expertise and interest, like maritime domain and how that might compare to space, or even different kinds of technologies, AI, cyber, any of those that really have an interaction with space, I think makes the field itself a lot richer and a lot more interesting and a lot more capable, where In a lot of cases, especially in the policy and the commerce world, we're really building the satellite as we're flying it. But as the example from the maritime domain shows, you don't have to do everything from scratch. There are lessons that can be learned from things we've already done. And so the more different kinds of expertise that we bring into the space policy and the space commerce community, I think the more chances we have of success in the future.
I think it was Inmarsat who did a study last year that found that most people don't understand just exactly how space touches their lives every day. Do you find that to be the case as well, that people either don't think about space or don't understand exactly what the impact is of things that are going on, 160 miles above the Earth?
Well, as I said, frustration about that very concept is what got me into space policy in the first place, was that unless you are a satellite operator or engineer, a lot of people just don't grasp how normal space is now, how part it is of your everyday lives. And so I do think that there are a lot of efforts going on to try to communicate that and make it known. The Center for Space Policy and Strategy actually produced a paper called The Value of Space, which is on our website, and that lays out everything from farming, finance, navigation, weather, all of these different aspects of everyday lives and everyday commerce that space really drives. And so we're trying to kind of put products out like this, do conversations like these to help explain this to the broader community. But it's certainly still kind of an uphill battle.
We ask this last question of all of our guests, and I want you, if you would, to look out over the next 10 to 15 years in space commerce specifically, and your role in that, and tell me what you see.
Well, me specifically, I really would like to go on one of those space tourist missions. I don't want to live in space, but I would love to just go up for a couple days. So my selfish 10 to 15 year hope is that the cost specifically of human space tourism goes way, way, way down, so that maybe someday I could go to space. But I think in general, maybe a less me-centric view of the future is, again, normalizing space. I think the more that commercial space enterprises can represent themselves and each other as part of how humans just live their lives and what's essential to the future of humanity, of policy, of all of it, I think that will help to drive everything else in terms of people entering the space workforce, people starting new companies and coming up with new ideas, and all the way up the policy chain of how that works, from Congress to, the White House, everyone understanding how space is important to their lives. I think that is a categorical shift that I hope we'll see in the next 10, 15 years.
Would it be important for those policymakers that you talk about to actually go to space, to see what it's all about, to have that experience, to be able to make better policy? Or can better policy be crafted by, as you read in the science fiction novels, the ground pounders?
Well, I mean, I've never been to space, and I would like to think that my space policy ideas are pretty decent. So I don't think it's an entire requirement. But I do think that the concept of the overview effect, which is kind of what you're describing, when you go up to space and you see that we're this fragile blue little marble and we're all on it together. I think it sounds certainly incredibly powerful. And I think the more folks, not just in policy, but of all walks of life, have that opportunity, I mean, that sounds amazing. But no, I don't think you have to go to space in order to do good space policy.
Well, I'm sort of like you. One of these days I'd love to go, but time may be running out for me.
I'm hopeful. We'll see.
You've got a shot. I don't know that I do, but I go in a heartbeat. Anyway, Robin, it's been a great conversation. Any closing thoughts for us?
No, I mean, this has been an excellent conversation. I really enjoyed it. So thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you for joining us. That's going to do it for this edition of the Terra podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Audible, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any of our podcasts or any of our other videos. You can also get daily updates on space commerce by subscribing to the Journal of Space Commerce on Substack at www.xterrajsc.com. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on X at XterraJSC. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
I wanna go faster, faster. Hands in the air, we're gonna crash. Searching for the answers. My Galileo, the proof is looking glass. Thirst for reason. A dreamer's eyes we gaze into. A sense of purpose, know my view. Like finding water on the moon.